Hello and welcome to POLYCOSM. My name's Christina and today's quick tip video is going to be all about posing figures in DAZ Studio. I use models for practically all of my illustration projects. Here are a few examples of how I've used figures in the past and how they've ended up looking once I've painted over everything. Now, the reason I use 3D models is because I really enjoy the creative freedom that 3D gives me. And what I mean by that is how I can use 3D as a way to block in a scene. And with that scene, I can experiment with different kind of lighting, atmosphere, composition, and so forth. It's just a way of working that I really enjoy. Every artist is different, of course. I just happen to really love working with 3D. So if any of you are interested in experimenting with 3D, DAZ is a free software and it makes it really easy to pose figures and then import those figures into Blender. So opening up DAZ, you're greeted with an empty scene, hopefully. Before doing anything else, make sure to go to Window, Workspace, and Customize. For the longest time, I didn't think you could use the middle mouse button to control the camera, like in every other software, but it turns out you can actually change this in this menu. So at the bottom, choose whichever modifier you want, like Orbit, click on the box next to it and input your keyboard shortcut here. In my case, I'm using the middle mouse button. I would highly recommend changing Pan as well, because that default keyboard shortcut is very weird. Lastly, if you want to zoom in by scrolling upwards on your mouse wheel, press the inverted mouse wheel button down here. Now that we're all set, let's get started. So opening up DAZ, you're going to be greeted with a home screen. You can just click out of this, it's not very important. The version I'm using is DAZ Studio 4.12 Pro. And on your left, you can see a bunch of tabs. The one you want to go into is Content Library. Go to Products, G, because our models, the ones that we're going to use, are called Genesis. And you have version 2, you have version 3, and 8. The one we're going to be using today is 8 because it has the most shaping options. And what I mean by that is you can make them more pear-shaped, you can make them more athletic, you can give them elf ears and so on. It just has the most options and is the most recent version. So going into Genesis 8, scroll down pretty far until you get to the models here. They're called actors. So just look in the right corner, you're going to see actor. And what you want to do is drag them into the scene. And there we go. Before we do anything, I thought I'd just explain the simple layout of DAZ. On the right side, you have the outliner. So here, all of your models are going to appear. So if we go to, for example, create, new primitive, and plane, it's going to show up here. And you can select them manually in the viewport like this or like this. But if, for example, we're working on our model and we only want to select our model and nothing else because maybe accidentally you'll hover over this and you'll get a seizure because this keeps blinking and it's very annoying, you can disable it here. That way we can't select it and we can only select our model. If we have several models, for example, if I select our model, go to duplicate and node hierarchies, and let's move that out. And we have a model very close to our own model, like this. And maybe we only want to select our model, but we keep selecting the other one. You can just disable it right here. So let's undo that. Let's tick this box, select our model, and just press delete. And that's going to delete the model. So you'll probably notice there's a small triangle right next to the name. If you press this, you get the options for the individual bones that makes up the model, and you can choose to hide them. So if you don't want to see the hip, you'd probably have to go to pelvis. There we go. So you can hide them, unhide them like this. Usually I wouldn't recommend doing that because importing them into Blender can be a bit weird. But sometimes you want, for example, only the head, so you can like disable everything except for the head. Or maybe your model doesn't have an arm, for example, and you can fill those gaps in Blender, so you can kind of remesh it and it will automatically fill those holes. But usually I just recommend importing the entire model. What I do like to disabling though are the eyelashes, because once you import them into Blender, it just does not look good at all. So all you need to do is open the tab, scroll down to Genesis female eyelashes and press delete. This just looks way more natural and it's just gonna look a whole lot better once you've imported everything into Blender. So let's talk about how to select specific body parts, how to deform them, and so on. One method of doing things is, for example, posing them like this, where you get a kind of ragdoll effect. I would not recommend posing the figure this way because it can be very, like you see, very erratic and unpredictable. And you want more fine control, especially if you have a specific pose you want them to be in. But sometimes it can be very useful, for example, with the arms, if you just want them, for example, straight in front, instead of choosing all of the individual limbs and posing them manually. What you can do is just quickly drag it in front there. And from here, you can choose the different controls. So usually the ragdoll effect works better if you choose something on the outer side, so the very tips of things. For example, the foot. As you can see, you get a lot of control here. Or the hand, for example. But if you choose something in the middle of the mesh, for example, the torso or the chest, it gets very unpredictable, and I would not use this method of posing. So now we've done a few deformations, but I want to reset the model. What you can do is just press the model, go to this little icon and press restore figure pose, and you're going to get the neutral pose again. Okay, let's start talking about the parameters here. As you saw just now, because I didn't have our model selected, all of the parameters disappear, but if I just press our model again, all of these different deformations and translations appear. So you have different transform modes. You have translation, rotation, and scale. And what those individual things do, translation is just basically where your model is placed. So it's the same as just moving these icons. If you want to move them and you regret your decision and you want to undo it, you can just, while you're moving it, press right click and it'll pop right back to your neutral stance. So you can do the same here. If you've, for example, gone too far and you're like, oh no, I don't like this, you can just right click. Next is rotation. So rotation basically rotates your model. So if you know your model is going to be flying, for example, it might be easier to pose them like this first, and then of course like posing your model like that. Maybe you want the arm in front, so you'll do this and so on. So you can see that's the easiest method. But you have to be careful with this method, because if you rotate your model too much and you put them in a pose and then you accidentally try to drag them through ragdoll mode, the behavior can become very unpredictable and start spazzing out like crazy. So just be very careful once you've like rotated your model a lot. So let's get our model to neutral again. Let's select it and restore figure pose. So scale is a bit of a weird one, because you can scale the model in a different direction. But as you can see, you can't really choose it right now because you would have to choose an individual limb. But even then, scaling is a bit of a weird one. Like you can see, if you have a character that, for example, has very long limbs, you can do it through this method. But it will deform the mesh in a very weird way. For example, if you choose the Y scale, like you can see, like this just does not look very natural at all. So just be very careful. If you want it to neutral again, just set it to 100. Something that can be useful though, for example, is this scale option here that scales it in all angles. So if you choose, for example, the head and then scale it, it can be useful. Or for example, the breasts. Sometimes I usually scale down the breasts because the breasts are quite prominent on this model, and it can come across as slightly pornographic when I pose them in Blender. So I usually scale it down a bit, or at least tone it down just a tad bit. So if you want to scale down the head of your model or the hands or the feet, I would recommend doing it a bit differently, because if I, for example, zoom in now, and I tried scaling it down, you can see it just becomes really weird. Yeah, you see things start clipping and it just goes crazy. So the better method is actually going through shaping. And what shaping does is basically transforms your model. So if you, for example, want her more of like a bodybuilder type, you can do it through these sliders and you can choose like less details, more details, or if you just want a lot of details on your body like this, but you want her, for example, a bit more emaciated, you can choose to put up this slider, or maybe more of a pear shape, or you can even combine these like this. And once you export them from here, it will retain all of that information. So this will basically show up the same way in Blender, which is very useful. Again, let's just reset all of these. So let's go to Genesis, and I'm just going to type in 0 for all of these. There we go. And as you can see in the drop down menu here, you get a lot of options for example, the head, the face, the eyes, the mouth, ears, and so on. So what I was talking about earlier, if you really want to scale down the head, the best method is going through shaping here, and you can choose to make the head smaller or bigger. Now with these models, I don't know if it's clear to you, but for me, when I usually get to the stage where I want to paint over the models, I've noticed the heads, hands, and feet are actually a bit too big, and it's not very realistic. So what I usually do is kind of scale it in the negative direction. So I usually scale it to like -5 or -10. So let's go for -5. And these proportions are just a bit more realistic. So if you want to follow my example, you can scale it down to -5. And let's go down to the hands and do the same for the hands. So -10 is usually what I put the hands to, and -10 for the feet as well. -10. So these are the proportions I use. I also usually scale down the chest, which you can do in the Parameters tab here, or you can go to chest, and here you get a few more options. You can give the models nipples, for example, or you can scale down the chest. You can't scale down the individual breasts, I think. I think you have to do that through parameters. So you just select the breast, go to parameters, and go to scale down here. And there we go. So just a quick look at all of the other parameters. For example, for the ears, you can do elf ears if you want. So you can choose the length here. Or for example, for the waist, if you want a navel, you can enable that here. But yeah, I would recommend just going through all of these and changing the parameters as you see fit for your model. And I know we're pretty late into this tutorial, but I should have mentioned this before. We've been mostly using the female figure, but if you want to import a male figure, it's just the exact same. You get all the same parameters and so on. So you can just import them like this. And let's hide our female figure, and let's get rid of those awful eyelashes. There we go. So you get the same kind of options. You get the bodybuilder, but it looks a bit different, obviously, because it's a male figure. So yeah, here it would be a bit more natural to maybe make him a bit more muscly, give him a bit more details, or you can make him more portly, like this. So yeah, just so you know, you can also import the male model here. So, but I'm just using the female model as an example. So one of my favorite things about DAZ is the ability to add facial expressions. So what you would want to do is click the head, go to parameters, and here in the pose controls, you have a drop-down menu, so you can choose the individual parts. You can choose the brow, cheeks, expressions, eyes, mouth, and so on. And you actually have a few template expressions. So if you just slide the slider, you can see all of the different ones. So you got angry, you got flirting, you got frown, you got shock, you got smile, a different kind of smile, and surprised. So sometimes if I know I'm gonna have a specific facial expression, for example, she's gonna be a bit afraid, I maybe go for like halfway of like afraid here, maybe like this, and then maybe I go to the brows and maybe compress the brows. I slide them up, and let's see, outer down. And if I go to the mouth, you can choose, for example, mouth open. So for example, she's screaming or she's in total shock. You can choose more of a frown and so on. So you get a lot of different options, and you can customize your model plenty. The only thing it doesn't do, I think you have to buy this additionally if you want to add this to your model, is the ability to kind of make the tongue stick out. So you kind of can do it to a certain degree. But for example, with the recent painting I did, I couldn't pose it. So I just got it as close as I could and then just painted over everything. So that's enough with the expressions. You probably get it. So let's get this to a neutral position again and let's get into the actual posing. So if you choose the individual limbs, you see you get a few options. You get usually front, back, bend, and twist. For example, the breasts, you get a few other options. You get up, down, you get side, and you get twist. So it kind of depends on what specifically you have chosen. When it comes to the hands and the feet, instead of posing them manually every time, you actually get a few templates to choose from. So you usually just select the hands and you see this pops up under pose controls. And here you can choose to, for example, make the fingers grasp or go out like this. You can make them chop. You can make them a fist or grasp something. You can make them spread and so on. You can also go and individually pose them. So say you have something that she's holding, but you want, for example, the hand spread a bit more and you want a bit more bend. You can then go in, choose these individual fingers and start bending them like this. And you can also pose the thumbs. You can make that bend. You can make that go up and down or twist. So you get a lot of options here. So let's get into the actual posing. Using PureRef, which is a referencing app that basically allows you to drop in images, I've just added in an image here. So I'm thinking we're gonna pose this woman on like a chair like this. But sometimes you don't have the chair, for example, and instead of trying to figure out like how she would be sitting on it, I thought we could kind of make a placeholder chair. So what you want to do is go to Create, New Primitive, and here you get a few options. So you can choose a few different types: plane, torus, sphere, cone, cylinder, and cube. What I usually do is just choose cube and then accept, and ooh, it's really big, so let's choose that and scale it down here to about here, I'd say. So I'm just going to copy this around, make a chair, and then we can start the posing process. So now that we have our placeholder chair, I put everything into a folder, and to rename that folder, the way you create folders is just you select all of the objects you want and go to Create and then New Group. What I want to do now is I'm going to make it so that we can't select any of the parts. So the way you do that is you go to this and unselect this. So now we can see through the chair and we can select the legs and the hips and so on. So first I'm just going to drag her down a bit. So I'm going to choose the hips and drag her down, and then I'm going to want to spread her legs. So let's choose her thigh and go side to side. Let's actually bend it like that, and then we can bend this part, and that's a bit too high up, so let's choose to bend it down there. And it's very useful having a ground plane because that way you can see if she's actually clipping through the floor. So I can choose to like rest it right on the floor like that. And let's do the same for this side. So I think that's okay for the legs for now. Let's go on to pose her arms. So I'm just gonna bring them up in front like this. And then I'm gonna try to bend her arms a bit, move to the front view a bit. There we go. And as you can see, I'm quite limited in the way I can pose it here. So I'd have to go and individually pose the limbs here. So I'm gonna choose the arm, gonna choose to bend it a bit. Maybe twist this. And right now you see it's like clipping through her breasts. So I'm gonna choose to bend the arm here and choose to maybe twist this a bit outwards. This is just a lot of having to get used to like the controls, so it's going to take you a while to probably get this right. So once you know how the figure reacts, it's going to become a very easy and quick process for you. But probably in the beginning, at least it was for me, like a very slow process. So I'm going to just speed up through posing her and we can see the end result. And there we go. It's not a one-to-one comparison, but I think it's close enough and it demonstrates what DAZ is capable of doing. I also thought as an addition I'd mention how to turn off the limits, because if you turn up the slider here, you see it stops at a certain point, and usually this is good because to someone who isn't as experienced with anatomy, they wouldn't know maybe how far the limbs would bend or twist or so on. But if you want to turn that off, you just go to the cogwheel here, parameter settings, and turn use limits off. That way when I try to bend it now, you see she reaches back much further. The second thing I thought I'd show is how to mirror a pose from one side to the other. So what you have to do is just select your figure, go to Edit, Figure, Symmetry. And here you get a bunch of options. So you usually choose Root, Recursive, and here you can choose if you want to mirror her left to her right to her left, or swap left and right. So in our case, we're going to mirror, for example, right to left. So that'd be her right to her left. And trunk notes, mirror Y and Z rotations, and accept. And there we go. It's all mirrored. Sometimes if you've posed the fingers and you've turned the limits off, like I just showed you, the mirror transform won't really work, so you'll have to manually go in and fix the fingers. So now that we're going to want to take this into Blender, instead of exporting everything, because I'll also export the floor and the chair and everything, what I usually do is just delete all of the meshes I don't want, like this. Go to File, Export, and then choose where to export it. I'm actually going to export it as an OBJ. And here in the presets, I've actually changed a few things. So if you want to kind of copy this, go ahead, press accept when you're happy, and then it's exported. Let's jump into Blender. And once you're in Blender, of course, go to File, Import, OBJ, go to where you saved it, Import, and there we go. There's our model. So it's very quick and easy, as you can see, and it shows up exactly like it was in DAZ. Obviously here we don't have the chair, so here in Blender you can import the chair and so on. So here's an example of a scene I created a while ago called Reaching for Gun, basically where I posed two figures together, and you can see like doing this from imagination could be very complicated, so being able to do this in DAZ and being able to see the camera angle and choose the camera angle as well can be very useful. And of course, once you start adding in light and atmosphere and so on, it can be a very useful tool for illustration work. So that's pretty much the end of this tutorial. I hope you found it useful and can see the different applications that DAZ can have in terms of like Blender posing or illustration work and concept art work and so on. Thanks so much for watching, guys. See you later. Bye.